Hello, everyone. I am Pastor Alexa Eisenbarth,
And I'm Pastor Heather Sparkman.
and we are the creators of the House of the Lord Lenten worship series. When we set out to develop this worship series, there was a lot of turmoil going on in the world around us, and it felt a little strange to enter into Lent, as we often do every other year, as a season of rigor and rigorous self reflection. And instead, we discerned that what our church needed and what our community needed was a time to enter into the house of the Lord, to understand that God is one who offers us great hospitality, and then out of that hospitality, we are to offer that hospitality to others. But first, we wanted to give people a taste of what it is like to be in the house of the Lord, in the presence of God, and to have that speak into who we are as a church and what kind of changes we might need to make as a church if once we learn about what the house of God is like, so that we can kind of match our church's ethos and practices to be more in alignment with what the house of the Lord is like. So I'd love to hear kind of how your experience of it has been, and if there's anything else you feel like, what did we set out to do, I guess, at this.
So, one of the things that emerges for faith communities, I think, in times of turmoil, not even turmoil within the community, but turmoil in the outside world, is the question, who are we? And we have to examine what are our core values that we always hold, and also look at how we're responsive to the turmoil around us without sacrificing who we are. And then, like you said, looking at the places where maybe we haven't been living into our values. And I think this series gave us that opportunity to have conversation with who we are, who God invites us to be, and how God gifts us first with home that we find in God, but then what that means as a community of faith, how we practice that with each other, and how we practice that out in the world. And I think that's what we set out to do, and we have in many ways accomplished that. But I think it's been more nuanced than I thought it would be. I think one of the things that has really emerged in this is how much the people in our congregation, at least, are feeling this need for community, which is part of what we talk about in the house of the Lord. The house of the Lord is a place where God's community can gather together. And the community has unique values that aren't necessarily found in other places in the world. And I've noticed that as the turmoil in the outside world increases, there's this deep longing that people are experiencing to come to a place that is true and authentic and hospitable and loving. And this series has both brought that out, that longing out, I think, and also showed us places where we have needed to examine if we're not living into that, and how we might change how we are so that we are really representative of the house of God.
Yeah, definitely. I think, too, one of the things that's been happening is that individuals and family units are also doing some of this self reflection on what it means to be a family and what it means, what kind of household or what kind of home they want to live in and create. And I think part of that for each one of those families that has shared some of those reflections has been just sort of the realization that having community surrounding them and their home, their household, their family is an essential piece to building a home and making a place a home. And so, yeah, people have made shifts in their lives and have done some great introspection about who they are and who their family is and what kind of home they want to live in. You know, what makes a place, a house, a home for them, and how they want to make shifts in that way.
Yeah, throughout the series, we've been singing the song North, which is a song that reflects on home not as a perfect place, but as a place where we're in it together, where we're aspiring towards something, where we're creating space for each other. And I think that has been one of the themes that has really run through this sermon series is that the house of the Lord, because we're human beings, God's house is perfect. But as human beings, the church doesn't live into that ideal perfectly. So we've had that guiding principle that God has given us this gift, and our job is to live into it which means that we're going to need things like reconciliation. We're going to need to be able to say, I'm sorry. We're going to need to be able to recognize where we need to confess something we've done. And we're going to be in it together. And I think what has really emerged is this idea that in spite of our imperfections, in spite of the places we get it wrong or step on each other's toes, that the house of the Lord is a place where reconciliation can happen, and that we value community over perfection, that we want to be in this together, and that this house of the Lord and this community does provide support to our individual families and homes in a way that is really valuable and transformative.
Yeah. I think too. So that song North, the reason it's called North is for a variety of reasons, but one of the pieces is that the writer really sees home as being a true north, right? It's like a guiding principle kind of thing, a guiding sense. And one of the lines I really appreciate in the song is like, it says something like repaint every day. And I think we see the people of God having to like rebuild and remodel and shift their idea of God's house over time from, all the earth to being in altars, to being in the tabernacle, to being in the temple. The temple is destroyed, rebuilding the temple, right? Like, and then into synagogues, right? And all the house of the Lord and their idea of what the house of the Lord is shifts so much over time. It has to be remade. And is often having to be remade because of their own participation at the house of the Lord, not because of anything God has done, right? But because of how they've participated faithfully or not in that house. And so I think it has turned out to be a nice sort of framework for Lent. Like I think we were kind of shying away from some of the Lenten themes, but then it really turned into like a deeply Lenten theme of figuring out what needs repainting, what needs remodeling, and how acknowledging just like our thinking shifting over time into something more and more faithful.
Yeah, I think about Lent as both that time for self-reflection, but I also think of Lent as a time of deep spiritual practice. And of course, with Ash Wednesday starting Lent, asking that question: what would our lives be like without God? What would our community be like without God? And I think that the series has led us through some of those questions in a roundabout way. It has certainly led us to self-reflection, but I think it's also caused us to think about the different ways, like you said, that the house of the Lord is built and then often torn down and rebuilt. But one of the themes that emerges is that the house of the Lord is rebuilt time and time again. And so it becomes like that true north, right? That in the midst of whether it's turmoil in the world, societal turmoil, personal turmoil, that there is this consistency, and that God's presence with us isn't bound by the way it looks. Like it doesn't have to be the tabernacle only, or the temple, or a church building that looks a certain way. That God comes to us and creates community among us in a variety of ways. And I think that's been so reassuring during this time of societal turmoil, to be reminded that even though the form might look different, God is constant, and that the house of the Lord is being rebuilt over and over again. And we can trust in that, which I think allows then for that self-reflection of what am I bringing, how am I participating in the community or the house of the Lord. So yeah, I think that was an unexpected theme that emerged for me. And we started, I think we set ourselves up though for that without even, well, maybe you planned it, but I hadn't thought about it as well. But starting with Ash Wednesday as, of course, dust is one of the themes of Ash Wednesday, but really talking about it as a remodeling or a reconstruction. And our sanctuary was actually happened to be going through a very, very small renovation project, but there was construction equipment in there on Ash Wednesday. We didn't clean it up. We didn't try to hide it. We made the altar area beautiful, and we left the dust. And so there was this invitation to be able to find the beauty in the midst of a rebuilding and a reconstruction. And to see ourselves that way, that the dust we're created from doesn't also, it doesn't limit us to being only works in progress. We're also beautiful at the same time. We're both um, and I think sometimes Ash Wednesday can be more of a subtraction. And this felt to me more of like an addition, like to see ourselves as whole in the midst of God's ongoing work in our life.
Yeah. 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 Just thinking about like how much people love doing DIY projects, right? Like that's a fun project to do, and like working towards making something beautiful, right, requires a bunch of mess in between, but the project and the work itself is really fulfilling. And so I think kind of framing it that way for people, for ourselves, is really powerful. um, just as like working, doing, acknowledging that one needs remodeling or whatever is not, does not have to be this self-deprecating experience, but is a really empowering one, that there's actually something to do and to work on remodeling things. One of the sort of theological themes we talked about was like not destroying everything, right? Like you don't just destroy and demolish everything in a remodel, right? You preserve what you can to reuse. And so I think taking on that principle for our internal spiritual work was really powerful too. Just at least was helpful for me. Of like, yeah, it's not just like a complete self-flagellation and self, deprecation, but it is like a very intentional sort of like surgical work, right? Like of remodeling and repurposing what you have for the life you want to live and for the house you want to build. I think too, one of the other pieces of this that was surprising that I don't think I planned for was that, right, like each one of us are a house of the Lord, right? Like that God dwells within each one of us. And so we both got to talk about that, right? Of that God lives within us and makes their home within us, but then also talking about that communal piece of the houses of the Lord that we build and the communities that we make around our shared faith. And so there was a nice balance there too.
Yeah, I think that's been very true. That this series has really integrated that idea of we are all unique individuals, children of God, and we have the Holy Spirit upon us. And this is always communal work, right? We're never in this faith as individuals only. God intended for us to be in community. And so when one of the scriptures is the story of the prodigal son, and in that I preached that one, and I talked a lot about reconciliation. And so often we come at that story as, this individualistic, I am now called to forgive from this story. And I think because we were talking about the household of the Lord, the story in the context of the household of the Lord, it began to picture it different. And I began to imagine the house of the Father where this giant party is being thrown. And, the grace in the story comes from the Father, and we can equate that to the grace coming from God. But that grace throws this giant party where all kinds of people are invited. It's a community event. And so instead of feeling the burden of that individual need to maybe forgive and reconcile with somebody that I'm holding ill will to, I started to imagine that, and there's just this God throwing this giant party of grace in the house of the Lord. And maybe I'm there and the person I'm trying to reconcile with is there. And it took the burden off of me as an individual, but it also invited me to participate in the work, or in the party in that case, in a completely different way. And so I think that it wasn't that. I mean, Lent is often a self-examination. It wasn't that self-examination wasn't there, but also it wasn't mine to completely accomplish it. God was there and the community was there in that story. And I think because we framed it within the house of the Lord, there was more of an emphasis on that than other times I've preached that story or heard it preached. And I think that for me was something that kept coming up during the series, right? That idea of in the house of the Lord, there's me, there's God, and there's this great community. And that's all a part of our faith journey.
Interesting. Yeah, it makes me think like, I think we talk a lot about our public lives. I think we imagine ourselves and work on ourselves as living out our faith in public. and especially in our community. And I think a thing that was helpful is that we had this conversation, did this exploration, sort of in the context of family, right? It's like the unit of like reflection and action and faithfulness was smaller and maybe more seemed more accomplishable, right? Like I can do this in the context of my family or in this community here, which then exercises our muscles to live out our faith in public more faithfully. Um, yeah, I also, as we put it together, uh, used lectionary text, and we put it together, and then at the end I realized there was like 1,000 other scriptures we could have used if we were just doing something based on the house of the Lord, right? Like there's very little exploration on the tabernacle or the temple or kind of what those things were, what those places were like, or how they were intentionally made or built. And there was thinking about from creation to revelation, like how God's house like evolves over time, and how God's presence is understood. But it was also nice to be like confined to these stories and to be challenged by and looking for God's house in them. Uh, I think it ended up being a lot more meaningful than sort of a like forensic look at the house of the Lord. It ended up being a bit more like theological and kind of naming values and characteristics of the house of the Lord rather than sort of the particulars, which I think was helpful and beautiful.
Yeah, I think taking that lens to the lectionary scriptures to look at the house of the Lord challenged me to move beyond just preaching the same sermon that I've always preached on these lectionary texts. It challenged me to ask different questions of the text. And I think out of that, the values emerged. But I also think it helped me connect the stories to the life of the community in a more meaningful way, which I really appreciated. That both the challenge in my preaching, but also offering a different look. I think particularly in American culture, we are very individualistic, and as much as I try to keep that out of my preaching, it is the water we swim in as Americans to look at things through an individualistic lens, and this challenged me to look at it from the aspect of the community and the house that we're building together. And it made the scriptures much richer for me, and I think it made my sermons different aspects of the text came out that I ended up really valuing and glad on both a personal and as a pastor on both levels to have explored those texts in a different way.
We also, just sort of by happenstance, a bit intentionally, but mostly by happenstance, are starting a visioning process in our church, sort of in the midst of this series. And so we were just sort of dipping our toes into that process. But I guess I'd love to hear what your perspective is. But I think in those initial sort of exercises we did as a community and are doing as a community, I think talking about what church is, right, what the house of the Lord is, and sort of what some values are and what some characteristics are of God's house are shaped some of that visioning. We asked long-term questions like, well, who are we going to be in 25 years? And then some what if questions. What if all of the barriers came down and something was possible that is your deepest dream? And I wonder and think that some of those responses that we got and the imagination we got was shaped by sort of a deeper faithfulness based on some of the things we're doing in this series rather than, I guess, like a sense of scarcity or like logistical need. I think we got more like dreams and imagination rather than like what do we have to do to survive or to put things together. But yeah, I don't know, did you see it popping up at all in that experience?
I think part of the way I saw it popping up in is the idea that the house of the Lord has both changed over time and has stayed the same. Even though we didn't do that forensic look across scripture at the different iterations of the house of the Lord, we certainly had it as an aspect. And then the values that have been in the house of the Lord, whether it was the tabernacle or it was even before the like the temples were built when it was moving with the people through the desert, and then the temples were built and then they were torn down. The idea that the presence of God brings eternal values no matter what the outside looks like, and to have our dreaming be based on those values: love, hospitality, grace, reconciliation, rather than saying like it has to look like this in 25 years. I think it gave people a permission to say, like, what if we didn't have pews anymore? What if we didn't even own this building anymore? So that the concept of the house of the Lord got bigger rather than smaller. And you can imagine not owning the building and still having a community of grace. So I think it really freed up that idea that the only way for us in this community to do church is exactly the same building, same configuration, and instead there was this like what will be the same: grace, love, hospitality, diversity. For these were some of the things that emerged when we asked that question, and then we can see what forms are needed for the time. So yeah, I think it really did help people come to that with a different perspective.
Sure. Yeah, maybe what's essential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it turns out pews might not be essential.
Sure.
Owning the building might not be essential. Hospitality is essential, and yeah.
Is there anything from this series, anything else that stood out to you as a meaningful moment?
We are in the process of putting out, or we have built, and we're going to install a little free pantry outside of our church. And so one of the Lenten practices that we invited people to was to gather one item of food per day during Lent. So 40 items of food for the little free pantry. And I for one thing, I just love the idea while we're doing the house of the Lord, we're asking people to stock the pantry of the house of the Lord, right? So while you're grocery shopping, think about the church. But it's really, the little free pantry isn't actually for the church, it's for the wider community. And I think that practice, so we didn't do a lot of traditional Lenten practices through this series. We had a Lenten devotional and we had the little free pantry food gathering as our Lenten practices, and I just think it helped expand the idea that the house of the Lord isn't just here in the building. It's not just in our homes. If you're doing your devotion with your family, it's not just there. It's at the grocery store when you're picking cereal. It's going to be for the community in the neighborhood where the church sits, because we're really stocking the community's pantry. Rather than stocking the church's pantry. And I think that really reflected a value of the house of the Lord, that we love and serve our neighbors, that this house is a house for the people who worship here, but it's also a house for our neighbors. And I just think that practice intersected so well. And we got so much more food than I expected to get. I think it feels to me a lot like we're going to end up setting the table of the Lord through this little free pantry, and it's going to be so abundant. Which, again, I think God has shown up in that Lenten practice, reminding us that, our God is a God of abundance, and the house of the Lord is a place where we can trust in that, and therefore be generous and share with our neighbors.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're recording this right before Palm Sunday, so we haven't gotten to Palm Sunday yet. But I think this idea of the house of the Lord is a place that blesses, right? Like it's a place from which blessing comes. I think that's one of the ways we've really lived into that. And I think it's a nice kind of capstone to this series, right? Like we've done a lot of inner work and reflection, and also kind of our capstone theological point being like, and also this is the place from which blessing comes for our neighbors. So yeah, it's been a really meaningful practice to do alongside this series, and yeah, I encourage you to do the same for your little free pantries or your local food bank.
Yeah.
But yeah, bless your community in some way through the season.
I think too, just another note about that is that we have quite a few people in our in our congregation and our community now who are new to church. Maybe new to Christianity, definitely new to the church community. And it can be so intimidating to say to a new Christian, for 40 days, you need to do this. But all of us grocery shop. And I think that integration of practice, of inviting people into a Lenten practice that didn't feel completely foreign to them, but also began to teach the values of a regular spiritual practice, of blessing others, of sharing, of God's abundance, all of those things. Um, yeah, I didn't realize at the time until I started to see the food coming in how this offered people a very accessible spiritual practice. And I think once you start engaging with the spiritual practice, it's easier the next time to take a step even further. And so I think for this series, for so many reasons, it was such a great practice, especially in a time where, at least for us, we're seeing people new to the faith. And trying to introduce them to our shared values and our shared practices within this house of the Lord.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's been a great series for those folks that
Yeah.
are new. Anything else we need to say about this series? I think overall it's been really powerful, meaningful. I think that it has helped us make our sanctuary an even more sacred place, kind of intentionally. It has moved people really deeply, including us. So it's been a really meaningful experience, and we hope you enjoy it and take it and run with it in your community.